Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Jeff Diamond, and it's really good to see all of you virtually. This is the second seminar that we're doing with Jake. It'll be of two or three more to go, or maybe one or two more to go. And hope everyone that was here attended the first one. And if you didn't, you're in for a treat because Jake is delightful and knows more about all of this stuff than anyone else around. So if everybody could put their microphone on mute, and if you want to.
Except for the introducer.
Yeah, Jeff, you muted yourself.
Oh, I muted myself, huh? Okay. So if everyone could put themselves on mute, and then if you have any questions, just type it into the chat area. I will relay those questions to Jake, and like that. So without further ado, here's Jake.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Symposium 2, where we continue down the path of aromatized wines beyond vermouth. You might call it hashtag not just vermouth. There's a lot to talk about tonight. We're gonna talk about a couple of special topics in drinking history, but at the end, there's gonna be some technical tasting topics about mixing with gin. So if you have some vermouth left, maybe from a couple of weeks ago, or just vermouth you have, and you have a traditional gin and a modern gin, you might want to play around with those later on. But in any case, the material will be there and you can play around with them on your own time as well. Tonight, since we're not talking about vermouth, we're going to be talking more about things that, at least in my view, go better with modern gin. But Americano and Quinquina, the two other great classic categories of aromatized wine, is what we're up to tonight. So we're going to cover what they are. We're going to cover talk about the rise of quinine, because it's kind of a microcosm for the rise of modern drinking, late 19th century. We're going to talk about what a spritz is and what a spritz isn't. We're going to taste 4 aromatized wines tonight, 2 Quinquinas, 2 Americani, and then, like I said, that special topic at the end, mixing with gin. This is my background. This is the mill at the top of the hill in Bastia on the island of Corsica. The mill is owned by the folks who own Cap Corse Mate, and they use it to advertise their wonderful Quinquinas. Once again, the prime directive: aromatized wines are wine. So these things go in the fridge after opening. How long they last is based on personal tastes, but in general, things that are as sweet as the things we're going to talk about tonight, you're looking at 3 to 4 weeks in the fridge pretty easily. Things that are drier, a little bit less. A brief recap of the first class. We talked about the ancient history and the early modern history of aromatized wine, the different components of aromatized wine, how you can break down and analyze each component. And then we got into vermouth, the history of vermouth, the regional subcategories of vermouth, a little bit of tasting, and then we had a nice little run on the Manhattan and related cocktails. If you want to take a look back at class 1, or if you missed class 1, it's on our YouTube page. I know I posted a link to that video on the Cocktail Today Facebook page, but it's also on our YouTube page. There's some other cool stuff on our YouTube page. Just search for House Alpens and you'll find it there. All right, what are Americano and Quinquina? Very simply, under European Union law, Americano is wine, and by that I mean something composed at least 75% of grapes, bittered primarily with gentian, but also with a bit of wormwood. The term Americano comes from a couple of different origins. One, the word amaricante, the word for bitterness in Italian. An Americano might be considered to be a little bitter, but also a societal use, the idea that adding bitters, dashing bitters to wormwood was thought of as an American idea in Italy. Quinquina, wine bittered with quinine, which is an extractive from a bark. You see the bark right there, the bark of the cinchona tree. Quinquina made in Italy usually has the category name Chinato, Chinato, with Barolo Chinato being the most famous, but by no means the only type of Chinato. Gentian, you see the root and the flower here. Both can be used as bittering agents and both taste remarkably similar. It's vegetal, it's earthy. Some people liken the flavor to the inside of a head of lettuce or the core of a head of lettuce. And it's the most common of the bitters. You know, it is really everywhere. Angostura bitters are not based on Angostura bark. They're based on gentian. Quinquina and Americano, which is a very well-known aperitif wine that we import, is based on gentian. Celers, which is an aperitif liqueur that we import, is based on both a distillation and infusion of gentian. Jeff can't sell it at his shops, but it is low alcohol and it has a real kind of interesting combination of perfume and earthiness.
But I can
particularly
drink it
well with like lemonade.
Jake, we've got a couple of questions so far.
Sure.
One is putting these in a fridge versus a wine fridge.
Put them in a real fridge.
That's what I thought. And then what about bitter spirits with wormwood versus a Quinquina?
So wormwood bittered spirits, there are certainly some out there. We import one called Alta Verde, which is a rendition of a classic style from what would now be considered Croatia. And Pelinkovac is another category, again from Croatia. That's wormwood, caramel, gentian, cumin. A lot of the other classic wormwoody spirits are wormwood that's been macerated and redistilled, which removes the bitterness but adds a lot of the high notes. Things like absinthe fall into that. In terms of cinchona in spirits, you see the odd what's called Quina calisaya type liqueurs. There's one made in Oregon. Martini makes one called Quina Martini, but it's heavily dosed with caramel and is not very bitter. They're certainly out there, but quinine is such an intense bitter flavor that lower alcohol things that have some texture from some other source tend to express quinine better. So either Quinquina with grapes for texture, or something like tonic water, which has sugar for texture, which has a lot of either a lot of sugar for texture or just is fizzy and non-alcoholic. But there are certainly spirit-based things of wormwood and cinchona out there. Quinine, you already saw the bark. Quinine is different fundamentally from wormwood and gentian if you look at the history of aromatized wines, because the bark, the tree, doesn't grow in Europe. Wormwood and gentian are endemic in Europe, and so they've been used since ancient times to bitter wine and whatever else people wanted to bitter. Quinine only enters European consciousness in the early 1800s, and of course it's first thought of as an anti-malarial. But over time, especially post-1848, the sort of growing peace and prosperity in Europe after the upheavals of 1848, quinine takes on a life of its own, and it becomes a wonder. I mean, I can't say it's a wonder drug because I can't talk about medicinal effects of alcohol, but quinine becomes kind of the everything cure. And I sometimes joke that quinine is like CBD. Everybody wanted it, but they weren't sure why, because literally its rise feels and looks exactly like the rise of CBD today. If anyone I apologize if anybody is really into CBD, because that might be seen as a little bit glib, but it was the new thing, and because it was so popular and so hip, especially in France, starting the 1860s, 70s, 80s, producers in far-flung parts of France would make Quinquina to advertise their region. They would use wine as the base, and they would use wine as the base of their concoctions because grapes were everywhere. But then they would do things. They would make sure that the profile of the product and the way they marketed the product both were advertisements for where they were. So Beer Quinquina from the Roussillon, very much depended on the grapes of the Roussillon, those warm, rich red grapes. Bonal, more spicy and bitter, was meant to be both an expression of strength, but also an expression of the Alps, something bracing and warming that you might have after skiing or with a fondue or a tartiflette. For Corsica, for Mate, Corsica in early modern France faced a bigger struggle. Being an island off the coast, it had never been a major vacation spot or a common spot for doing business for mainland French. As we get into the 1860s, 70s, 80s, wealth is concentrating in cities. The building of railroads allows product to get across France. The growth of popular media and marketing and branding, all of a sudden, the folks on Corsica could really market themselves to the rest of France as more than just a curiosity and a source of citrus fruits. And so Mate really took that identity to heart. They made things that really express Corsica using Corsican grapes and Corsican citrus, but also used imagery such as this image of the island to market Corsica as a great place to come for a vacation, or maybe even as an all-weather port to do some business. But it all was around this idea that quinine was the new thing, the hip new thing, just like stuff comes out like that today. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of concepts before we got into tasting was what is and isn't a spritz. So the word spritz, as you might imagine, is a German word. And the most common story of its emergence is not in modern Venice, but in the north of Italy, all the way from Venice through the Alto Adige during the Austro-Hungarian occupation. And, a lot of this is legend, and so I'm not going to sit here and cite chapter and verse, but the simple fact is that by the mid-1800s, the idea of a drink lengthened with fizzy water and given the name of the sound it made, spritz, was common. Now, fast forward another 20, 30 years, you start getting more of a leisure class, again, wealth concentrating in cities, and these longer drinks that were more volume of liquid and took longer to drink, became symbols of this leisure class. But the name spritz stuck. Now, there's one very large brand, spirit-based, so Jeff can't sell it, that has, over the last 20 or 30 years, very heavily marketed itself as this thing that you have to put in a spritz. Well, that product wasn't established. That product is Aperol, of course, a wonderful product, but it wasn't created until 1919, which is long after this term became very popular. And so what that means is if it's got bubbles, it's a spritz. Don't worry about it. On the left, this is a Salvador Dali painting of his conception of the context of a soda siphon. And on the right is actually the folks at Koki disgorging a bottle of sparkling wine, since they make sparkling wine as well as aperitif wine. So no matter what Big Liquor says, if it's long and got bubbles and it makes you feel at leisure and happy, it's a spritz. All right. Any questions right now before we dive into some more conceptual stuff?
Yeah, there's a fairly decent book on spritzes by Talia Baiocchi and Leslie Paraso. It's got some nice recipes in it and has all sorts of ingredients besides Aperol and et cetera. Several really good ones for Capoletti.
Yeah.
I'm
if Talia Baiocchi writes it, buy it. That's a very simple thing. She's great. And Leslie Paraso is opening a wine shop in New Orleans. So we've talked about what Americano and Quinquina are, very conceptually, what gentian and quinine taste like, a little basic idea of how to use them. These are things that would have classically been drunk in spritzes in various ways. Americano, we talked a little bit in the vermouth class about how Italian things tend to be sweeter than French things. And that's certainly the case when it comes to Americano versus Quinquina. Americani tend to be sweeter, so they can be lengthened perhaps even more with soda water. But also, Americano a lot of Americani are heavily driven by the grapes they're based in, and so aromatic spirits work very well with them, things like agave spirits or aromatic gins. Quinquina, because Quinquina nationally became a big thing in France, but different regions wanted to express themselves differently. You can really break down Quinquinas into two subcategories. One is Quinquinas where the flavor is very much driven by the base grapes, and one is Quinquina that is much more driven by the botanicals. And so we have an example of each tonight in the Cap Corse Mété Blanc and the Cap Corse Mété Rouge. The grape-driven ones you can use much like Americani with gin and aromatic spirits if you're going to mix them with spirits, but they tend to be a little bit subtler, a little more put together. Maybe you can use a little bit less of the spirit in a cocktail. The ones that are more driven by their botanicals, I find work best with wooded spirits, not necessarily bourbon and rye, but things that maybe are aged in used barrels. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later too when it comes to wooded gin. But this is a very basic background of how you might think about using these if you're constructing drinks of your own. Our website has many great recipes with all of these products, of course, and they're reasonably Googleable. There's a lot of good recipes out there. All right, you guys ready to taste? I'll take silence as a yes.
Yes.
Cool. So we're going to start with the folks at Cap Corse Mété. Mété, Louis-Napoleon Mété founded his company in 1872 to create Quinquina to express Corsica to the rest of France. So he wanted to use Corsican ingredients, but also capture some of the Corsican, the sense of Corsica and being Corsican. So he did that with two Quinquinas. The base of each of the two, the Blanc and the Rouge, are the same. And it's very important here to understand, to think about when you're tasting these, that the base is not fermented wine. The base is unfermented juice that's fortified with neutral alcohol right away. This mixture is called Mistel. Now, Mistel, as long as it's at least 75% grape juice, is regulated the same as wine, as of course is fortified wine that's partially fermented, because there's no good interest in the government trying to micromanage how much grape juice has been fermented in products like this if they end up at a certain amount of alcohol. So these things do count as wine, etc. But when you use unfermented juice is less aromatic than fermented wine. So so it's something that's Mistel based will have less nose from the grapes, but more primary flavor from the grapes than something that's based in wine, which will have a lot more nose, but the flavor will be, there won't be this brash flavor and acidity from the grapes. Some of the acid, malic acid will be converted to lactic acid, etc. It will be a little bit softer. So the grapes are Corsican grapes, Vermentino from the Cap Corse, from the northern tip of Corsica, and Muscat from the eastern side of the island. And then the other way Mété wanted to express the island of Corsica is through the use of citrus. And the citrus in the Mété Blanc is something called cedrat. Now, those of you who are of the Jewish persuasion will know cedrat as etrog. It looks like a big, ugly lemon, but it's much, much thicker skinned and much more perfumed. It's actually a descendant of Buddha's hand and yuzu. The modern cedrat originated in the Eastern Mediterranean and has been on Corsica for about 400 years. So this guy, what I love about the Mété Blanc is this combination of the characteristic of the grapes and being relatively dry for these sorts of things. Mété doesn't add any sugar over and above the sugar that comes from the unfermented grapes. So this is on the dry side and that great acidity. So I love this as a spritz because it comes across as something that really gets you going for a meal. But because it doesn't have a ton of aromatics from its own grapes, you get a nice showy aroma from the citrus. I really love mixing this with very showy aromatic spirits. So a floral gin or a Blanco tequila. And in terms of pairing it with food, I love it with with sheep's milk cheeses, mainly because that's most of the cheeses on the island are sheep's milk cheeses, and that goes together thing goes pretty well. But I have it on very good authority that it works well with hot smoked salmon. So
Hey, Jake,
yes,
is Cedrat the same as Cedro in Italy? Okay,
yep,
thanks.
Cedro is the Italian word for Cedrat. So if you've ever had the Nardini Acqua di Cedro, which is a liqueur, that is the same fruit. Now, that's quite a bit sweeter than this is. And when you sweeten Cedrat very, very heavily, you end up with a characteristic that I can't get away from describing it as Sprite. Whereas here, I think you get a little more of the pure perfume and a drier character. You get a little bit more of a pure perfume, a little bit more of the bitterness, and a little bit less of that kind of Sprite thing. So now the Rouge is a whole other story. This is a very, very different product. And with this product, Louis Napoleon Maté was trying to capture the not only botanicals and flavors that were common on the island, but also kind of the independence and spirit of the Corsican people in a bit of a fierce way. So the other botanicals, there's more quinine in this. There's a bit of gentian, and then the other botanicals beyond the quinine, walnut husks. A lot of walnuts grown on the island. The walnut husks don't have the protein in them, so we don't think that they have an issue for nut allergy, folks. And then bitter orange. Bitter orange provides that real kind of grip. The walnut and the bitter orange really provide that grip on the palate. So this is the one that's, I think, for some people can feel very drying when you taste it neat, but it dilutes really, really well. And that's something a lot of quinquinas, they love dilution. It's that primary acid from the unfermented grapes also helps kind of dilute them. That said, being something on the bitter side, I do recommend if you spritz this to garnish it with a grapefruit peel. When you smell grapefruit oil, you start to burn off bitter receptors on your tongue, so you won't taste as much bitterness when you drink the drink. The real fun I have with Mété Rouge, though, is mixing this with, I call them here gently wooded spirits. And for that, I mean spirits generally that are raised in used barrels or large barrels. So things like Scotch whiskey, wood finished gins, which we'll talk about more later. My first love, though, for Mété Rouge is Calvados. And so the drink that's pictured there is just a very simple highball, equal parts Calvados and Mété Rouge, very long with soda and a little lemon peel. Because this is more bitter, it stands to reason that it works better with more salty snacks. So something in the ham or salami realm is quite appropriate. If you ever go to Corsica, the charcuterie there is unsurpassed. And make sure you go in like January, because there's a seasonal thing they make called figatello, which is a liver sausage that is dry, basically hung in the rafters of wine shops, more or less, to dry. And you can eat it raw, or you can cook it on a plancha, and it is absolutely fabulous.
Hey, Jake.
Yes.
Someone has asked if you could make a few comments about Bonal.
Sure. So Bonal, and we'll talk more about Bonal later too. Bonal is another example of a bitter-driven quinquina, or a botanical-driven quinquina. It comes from the French Alps. Actually, what I'll do here is bring up our website and show you that. So just so people, I'm not just talking into a slide that says something else. This is our website. This is a quinquina page. So beer, Coqui Barola Canado, of course, also a quinine bittered wine. So Bonal, and this sort of says everything you want to know about it. So this picture captures so much of it. Bonal was always sold as quinquina, even though there's a gentian flower on the label, because gentian is that local hook, that local botanical for the French Alps that Bonal used to help make it an expression. Hippolyte Bonal used to make his quinquina an expression of the French Alps. Come here for a vacation. You can drink this to get ready for your tartiflette or afterwards, or to brace yourself before or after some skiing. I find Bonal to be very much on the savory side of the world of aromatized wine. And my favorite thing to do with Bonal is to take, if I have someone who feels, someone that I'm talking to or working with who feels like they're really good at making Manhattans, Bonal is the next aromatized wine that I want to give them to work with, because it has the same, about the same overall bitter sensation of a good red vermouth and about the same sweetness, but it acts on the palate completely differently and makes for very savory stirred drinks. I also love Bonal mixed with a nice dry hard cider, or maybe even with a decent sparkling wine. Beer, which is the other Quinquina in our French Quinquina in our portfolio, is a grape-driven Quinquina, Grenache and Carignan Mistel. It's from the Roussillon, which is sort of the home of Grenache and one of the homes of Grenache and Carignan in France. This one, think of this as almost like a refreshing port. The quinine is much more subsumed within the aromatics of the grapes, and also the other aromatics they add, things like sweet orange and cinnamon. I like it just on ice with a lemon peel, or just with a little tiny bit of a very aromatic white agave spirit.
Thanks for that, Jake.
Sure. So that's the world of Quinquina. Mété Rouge is certainly not necessarily the most inviting thing we've ever imported, but to me, if you get into it and you really start exploring how it works with those kind of light brown spirits, and especially with dilution, it was really, really expressive. And I gotta say that I really love working with Mété as a producer. It's young people who run it. The price is good. It's said, there's so much about the product, the products that express things that we already love about Corsica. Like if you're into Corsican wine at all, these things demonstrate so much of those characteristics as well. The package looks good, etc. So we really, really love working with Mété, and how the what goes into the bottle and the history dovetail together so well. So that said, it's time to hop a ferry or a short plane ride and north to Italy and to Piemonte and to our friends at Cocchi. We talked about the Vermouth di Torino last time.
Yeah. A couple of questions came in. Are there any codes on the Mété bottlings that you can determine how long or when it was bottled?
There probably are, but they're not as, I don't recall where they are.
Gotcha. And why is the embossing on the Mété bottling upside down on the shoulders of the bottle?
It's so you can see down into the case and see what it is.
Ah,
yeah,
clever.
It was not at our request. We make a lot of packaging requests of our suppliers, mainly having to do with being able to read the caps and know what something is. But no, that was them before we ever asked about anything like that. So. All right, Americano Rosa. So again, Americano, wine, and gentian. Now, Cocchi, if you'll recall from the last time, Cocchi is a winery in Piemonte, and their aromatized wines use the great aromatic grapes that they also grow to make sparkling wine. So they grow Moscato to make Asti Spumante, Moscato d'Asti, but also to make Vermouth di Torino and Cocchi Americano Bianco. They grow Bracchetto to make Bracchetto d'Acqui, but then also to make Americano Rosa. So Bracchetto is this beautiful aromatic red variety. It tends to be made into this off-dry sparkling wine that's really good with cookies and sorbet called Bracchetto d'Acqui. And so then they take some of that juice and they make an Americano with it. They ferment it dry and back sweeten it, but you still get those great showy berry and floral aromatics from the grapes. Now, what they do with the Rosa, of course, they have to have gentian in it. They have to have wormwood in it to make the law, but they only put a tiny bit in there just so they can make the law. And they put a little bit of quinine in it as well, because that's what they like. But with the Americano Rosa, they also add rose and ginger as additional aromatics, as well as citrus. But the rose and the ginger, to me, really play up the aromatics of the grape. And it makes a lot of sense because Koki, being a winery, they want to be able to really hit you over the head with the grapes are a big part of our aperitifs. That said, the rose and ginger also adds a little extra bitterness. And so this is another one that I really like with a grapefruit peel if you're going to make it as a spritz. Those of you who've ever been to Cure in New Orleans, which is, I like to call my favorite place in the world to drink a cocktail, they have over the years done quite a few drinks involving lower proof bourbons and Koki Rosa. And there's something about that combination that really brings out the ginger notes that's really, really cool. It creates a nice kind of whiskey drink that might be on the sweet side, but really dances across the palate. That said, again, an aromatic grape here. So I tend to like aromatic spirits with it, whether that's, again, a floral gin, a Blanco agave spirit. But my personal first love with Koki Rosa is aquavit. Aquavit, Koki Rosa, and Peychaud bitters is a combination I've tried with about 25 different aquavits, and they all seem to work. And then that line at the bottom, about 8 years ago, I sat with a cheesemonger in Austin, Texas, and we played around with a lot of different cheese and aperitif combinations. And we hit on Parmigiano Reggiano with Koki Rosa. And I can't explain why. I guess there's something having to do with the bitterness cutting the protein of the cheese enough that it brings out the lacticity. But I'm sure there's much smarter people out there that can explain that better. But if you haven't had Koki Rosa and Parmigiano Reggiano, it's a really cool combination. Oops, that was the wrong button. Any other questions before we talk a little more concept stuff? All right. So, we talked about spritzing all of these things. And again, anything bubbly is a spritz, but, I do get this a fair amount from folks. What about the one I had in Italy? Well, you already know that the word spritz comes from a long time before the world of the light red bitters that are often put in spritzes these days. But the red bitter spritz still goes back into that era because there was a time when red bitter aperitivos were made with wine. And Cappelletti is one of those. Aperitivo Cappelletti, the full name of the company is Antica Erboristeria Cappelletti. And there's a lot in just those words. Cappelletti is the family name, and it's still family owned. Maddalena and Luigi run it now. Luigi is the technician, and Maddalena is the muse and the business manager. Erboristeria means natural pharmacist. And in fact, if you go to the town of Trento, the city of Trento, which is kind of the first big city north of Verona, you'll still see an herbalist in the big square in town, in one of the squares in town, with the Cappelletti name on the facade. It's not owned by the Cappellettis anymore, but they still sell a lot of Cappelletti products. And then Antica, for me, in the world of alcohol in Italy, Antica to me refers to before 1919. Before because 1919, not coincidentally when Aperol and things like that were introduced, but it takes a war to make neutral alcohol cheap because a modern war required a lot of industrial alcohol. And so people who are making botanical liqueurs and wines before 1919, they couldn't get alcohol as cheap. And so they had to use less of it, distilled alcohol. They had to use less of it. So they had to use wine because wine was all around them and wine was going bad. So they would use wine to make things. Cappelletti also make a product called Elixir Novasalis, which is wine-based, but is one of the most bitter things you'll ever have in your life. This is not that. It is technically an Americano because it is a wine bittered with gentian. The category of red bitter, Campari and Aperol being the most famous examples, is defined by a red color, gentian, and then a combination of bitter and sweet citrus. The folks at Campari are one of the biggest buyers of one particular type of bitter citrus. Them and Coca-Cola buy almost all of it in the world. Luckily, there are other bitter citruses available for folks like Cappelletti to make their red bitters. But being wine-based, you get the texture of the wine and the acid of the wine. The texture of the wine means you don't have to add as much sugar to get an overall texture in the finished product. And the acid of the wine means that you get a really great refreshing character in it. So I really love using this in Negronis to make a Negroni that makes you want to have dinner afterwards. It's not as sweet, more refreshing, kind of lets the bitter botanicals dance across your tongue and across your palate. Cappelletti is naturally colored. The color is carmine or cochineal. It is the traditional red color. It's what Campari was colored with until the mid-90s or late 90s. It's extracted from the wings of a small scale insect. That said, you buy it as a powder. It's actually yellow in low concentration. And of course,
what kind of wine is Cappelletti made from?
The wine is much like with Dolan. The wine is pretty neutral, mostly Trebbiano, mainly there for texture and acid. They do put a little bit of wormwood in it again, so they can label it as Americano. It's the simplest route to market for them, but definitely something that's driven by gentian and citrus. And of course, like any spritzy drink, it's going to go well with potato chips or anything salty. But if you want that red bitter, that big bowl glass red bitter spritz like you had on that one time on that one trip, because this is based in wine, you don't have to open any sparkling wine to make the spritz. And I just thought this was the most kitschy picture of club soda I could find. It's actually from the Amazon listing for Canada Dry Club Soda. Yeah, the wine's already in there. You don't need to add more wine. I mean, with the right sparkling wine, especially a really good cava that's got some minerality, it's really lovely mixed with Cappelletti. But if you only have very basic prosecco or something, I would say skip it and just open a club soda. I think it works better. So I may be I may be in the minority on that, but I really do think that you don't need the wine to make a spritz. And of course, when you're making spritzes at home, the last thing you want to do is open a bottle of sparkling wine just for a few ounces. So to recap this part of it, we do have one more topic we're going to go into, but we've gotten to this point. We've talked about wormwood, bittered with wormwood, which is very herbaceous. I find that it stimulates the tip of my tongue. We've talked about Quinquina, the great sort of explosive history of Quinquina in the late 19th century, bittered with quinine. And we talked about Americano, bittered with gentian, earthy and vegetal. I find it hits me on the kind of the middle of the tongue, but also tends to be on the sweet side. So these are three very different categories of bitter things. And I think it's important to understand that they aren't, you can't always swap out one for the other just willy-nilly. That they express on the palate differently, they have different histories, they have different technical aspects in mixing, and that's not a bug, that's a feature. And thus we turn to this. Warning! This is not science. This is something I came up with. I've kind of validated it with a lot of people. It's a technique. It doesn't work for everything, but it is an idea in mixology. It is a bit of ology in mixology. And I think it's kind of fun. And I've seen on the Facebook group, y'all have a lot of different gins that you like to mix with. And I think this is a way to kind of focus or help you focus in thinking about different ways to mix those gins. But it is just a technique. That said, Jeff thinks it's cool.
Oh,
that's
Lord.
Jeff, guys.
Yeah, in 1977, sitting on top of the Aral Coliseum, wearing earth shoes.
That's a great photo. I mean, that could totally have been a cigarette ad.
Thanks for embarrassing me, Jay.
We love because we kid. So I invite you to take a small leap of faith with me. Whenever I taste things that are botanically based, especially things that are primarily infusions of botanicals, I find that yes, they have bitterness. They have overall bitterness, but they also, bitterness is not something that expresses on only one part of the tongue. And every different bitter botanical that I taste kind of hits me in a different place from front to back. And, you can go way down this rabbit hole and actually map, different bitter botanicals or different highly flavored botanicals. You might not necessarily call them bitter, across your tongue from front to back. And everyone's map will be different, but if you think about it, if you're mixing different strong flavors in a cocktail, you don't want them all to hit the same part of your tongue, because that part of your tongue will be tired, and you won't want to have another sip of that drink because you'll be waiting for your tongue to kind of recover. If you map, if you spread those stimuluses or stimuli across your tongue, you might come up with a drink that's more harmonious. Again, just a technique. So if you want to do this with basic botanicals, you can chew on them, especially things like herbs or fruits. You can chew on them. You can make a little tincture. I tend to infuse botanicals in 20% alcohol, because that's kind of the ABV of a lot of cocktails when I'm mapping. Or, if you're talking about a product, especially things like a gin, a botanical spirit, or an aromatized wine, you can just taste them. But it's really, 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 really important, if you think at all, that the stimulus that you're getting, that numb feeling you talk about at the end here, is from alcohol or acid, dilute more. So when I'm mapping a gin, for example, when I'm thinking about, is this gin a traditional gin that's very junipery, or something that's more floral or herbaceous, I'll dilute them down to 10 or 15% alcohol when I taste them, because it separates flavors, and it really brings out what is core, what is the most prevalent to the fore. Your tongue map may be different from mine, but I'm going to present mine, which I have validated with a good number of strong cocktail minds around the country. But yours may vary, and that's fine. That's what makes cocktails different. But you can blame Jeff for this one if you don't like it. That's a great photo.
Yeah, Spain.
Where is that?
It's in southwestern Spain, Old Vine, Morvedra, and I am flashing gang signs.
Well, so this is the other thing that it took me years of selling gin to think about, to really be able to think clearly about this. A lot of people out there think juniper in gin tastes like pine. And there's two very strong stimuli that may make you think that. One, Tanqueray has this very piney element, especially on the nose. And two, we think about juniper bushes, and juniper bushes, of course, being evergreen and piney. But if you think about how most gin is made, which is either, in some way a volatilization of juniper extracts, whether that's in a gin basket, or more commonly just dumping the botanicals in alcohol and then turning on the still. If you taste a juniper maceration, it's bitter. It's tactile. But bitter things in a macerate generally are too heavy to come over a still when that still is turned on. So a couple of Novembers ago, I was at the Hayman's Distillery, Hayman's in London, the gin that we represent. And the distiller was actually tasting a bunch of juniper-only distillates, because he was checking a few different juniper suppliers for the profile he wanted. And so I sat there and tasted with him, and tasted heavily diluted. He had distilled them to, I think, about 45, 46% alcohol. And then we tasted them heavily diluted. And the thing that was so clear to me, and this is an example of mapping a botanical, the thing that was so clear to me was how juniper in distillation was not piney, was not sharp, was not astringent. it was oily and fat and rich, and mainly hit me on the middle back of my tongue. Some might say the middle, but middle back of my tongue. And it was this warming sensation. It was almost more something I felt than something I tasted. And, you know, very fortunate to work with Heyman's a very traditional gin producer, but that moment really crystallized a lot of the things that I think about when I think about the mixology of gin. And so when I'm talking about traditional gin, I'm talking about gins, whether or not they come from English producers or whatever, but gins where that oily, dark, rich character comes through very strongly in the gin when it's diluted. So here's my tongue map when I'm thinking about mixing gin cocktails. So we talked a little bit about wormwood, gentian, and quinine already. To me, those come across very clearly, although again, people's thoughts may differ. Solaire's is all gentian, so I went ahead and put that in here. Angostura Bitters is mostly gentian. You know, traditional gin sits back here. Maraschino sits all the way in the back. And if you think about a lot of cocktails that incorporate a little bit of maraschino liqueur, they actually make a lot of sense. Floral and herbal gins, the primary modern gins that you see, your Hendrix, your Suntory Roku, things like that. To me, the defining characteristic for me is that when I dilute them, I feel much more of the stimulus forward of my tongue than I do toward the back. Aquavit is very much in that same way. A lot of anise things kind of sit here. And then the things at the front, I put Cardamaro in here, just, you know, that's another aromatized wine that we import that works that way. But wormwood, caramel, a lot of high caramel things. And here you're talking about things like a lot of big brand Amari that are very dark in color, tend to be dark in color because they have a lot of caramel, because that's what Italians like. But the other one here, for the purposes of this conversation, wooded gin. And this is something I've tasted a lot of wooded gin in my life, and some of them are really tasty. But the simple fact is, from my perspective, is if you are mixing with a wooded gin, the primary thing that comes out when that gin gets cold and diluted in the cocktail is wood. And so you have to account for that wood when you're thinking about how to mix a simple drink with a wooded gin. So again, this is my thoughts, my tongue map. You can come back to this. Maybe I'll post this as a photo on the group. And here's our little frog. This is the best long-tongued frog we could find in the stock images file. I would love for someone to give this guy a name. I don't know if anyone can, but yeah, that's our frog. So what does it all mean? Well, one thing is not gin related. Vermouth and Quinquina are all really very tasty together. I particularly like to mix Camoes and Mété Blanc, or Dolin Rouge and Mété Rouge. If you've got a juniper gin, mix it with vermouth. Again, spreading those stimulus across the tongue. If you've got a not juniper gin, don't judge. It's okay. There's a lot of great ones out there. Just don't mix it with vermouth. Mix it with an Americano or mix it with a Quinquina. Basically, depending on how much sugar you think you need to add to it to make it harmonious. And then if you've got a wooded gin, this is a lot of trial and error here. I find if you mix it with a Quinquina that is not grape driven, you're going to support the wood in the mix, but still spread out the flavors across the palate. But the most important thing, of course, is to play around, because there's a decent chance that I'm completely full of it. This works for me. This works for some really great cocktail bartenders that I've worked with this on. But you may still decide quite rightly that I'm full of it. So a few combinations that I really like. Of course, I got a plump for the gins that I sell. Heyman's London Dry, really great textured gin, tons of juniper texture in a classic martini. The one on the top right, Royal Dock, is the Heyman's gin that they sold to the Royal Navy. It's high strength, 57%. Still pretty well textured from juniper and from licorice root, but definitely hot. With Dolin Rouge. This combination is actually my father's favorite martini. And yes, you can call it a martini even if it has sweet vermouth in it. But then a couple of modern things. I got to hand it to our big brand friends at Beam Suntory for a modern gin. You know, Roku kind of straddles modern and classic, and so I really love it with Camose, but I also really love it with Mété Blanc. So you almost, to me, Roku is almost like that bridge gin. Something that's more overtly floral or herbal, something like Hendrix, you're gonna definitely want to mix it with a Quinquina. But this one, I wouldn't necessarily mix Roku with a dry vermouth or something that's particularly astringent, but it works really well with Camose, but also works really well with Mété Blanc. And then few in Illinois, to me, their wooded gin is one that where the botanicals actually have a half a fight, but still it's the wood that is the main thing going. And so to me, with wooded gins in general, and there's a lot of wooded gins out there, Mété Rouge and Bonal, the Quinquinas that are not as much driven by the base grapes are the things that I think work really well. And don't be afraid to take that mixture and dilute it with soda water, because a lot of times you'll bring out flavors in both the gin and the Quinquina when you do that. So this is some very basic ideas of combinations. Again, a huge fan of Roku is that kind of bridge gin between modern and classic. But again, your mileage may vary. So, and with that, there's a lot more out there at our website, alpens.com, which I took you around in the last class. I can certainly do a quick tour again. Our YouTube channel has other videos other than the first class of the cocktail of the day thing. And then we also have plenty on Instagram, especially Instagram. We do not as much on Facebook and Twitter, but lots more information out there. Of course, we're very fortunate. A lot of great retailers out there that dig what we do and have nice stocks. So if you ever have difficulty finding stuff, let me know, and I can put you in touch with the rep from our company that covers them, and they can help you find what you need to get.
So Jake, there's another question, and thank you very much. So let me scroll up to the question. Hendrix with Cap Course Blanc or Rouge? What do you recommend?
Blanc. To me, if you're gonna mix an unwooded gin with Mété Rouge, then you want to make a Negroni type drink with that and something like Dolan Rouge. And that's a hard combination to really squeeze together. There are probably some gins out there that work really well in that combination, but if I'm going to do Dolan Rouge and Mété Rouge together, I'm probably reaching for a good blended Scotch as the third element.
So if I were to pour a finger of this in my glass, which I just have, this Kenobi, which is a straddles between modern and traditional, Cap Course Blanc.
Yeah, I would do if you have a Blanc Vermouth handy, I would maybe try side by side, one with the Mété Blanc and one with the Camose or the Dolan Blanc.
Cool. So everybody, you can you can unmute yourself, and if you have any questions for Jake, ask away. We're planning on doing at least one more, probably in connection with Rob's group now pouring on Madeira, and we're probably going to be doing one on gin, and we're probably doing one on rum. And I'll keep all of you guys alerted as to those.
And one more quick thing, if this, we did a very, very quick run through this idea of tongue mapping and botanical mixing. If y'all are interested in that stuff, we sell a lot of products that are driven by one or very few botanicals, some of which our man Jeff can sell at his shop. But I can certainly talk more about botanically driven products as well. We could do a session on that as well.
Well, I started this group actually to sort of get away from the shop. So if I can sell it, that's great. If I can't sell it, that's great. I've learned so much from this group and from the group members, and I continue every day to learn a ton. And to me, it's all about the knowledge and the fun, and of course, the alcohol.
Excellent. Well, with that, I'm gonna stop the recording. We can certainly. Well, are there other questions? Or substantive questions. All right, I'm going to stop the recording. We can certainly stay on and hang out. I still have about half a Negroni left, but thanks for all your questions and all your time, and I'm going to stop the recording.